Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in just a minute. If folks could take their seats, please. We're going to get started in just a minute. Good morning. I'm Ross Weiner, Executive Director of the Education and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. Welcome to this first session of day 2 of the Ideas Festival. We have a great session for you. So this morning is a talk with the top session. I'm also going to claim it for the Ideas in Education track. We have David Leonhardt, an economics columnist with the New York Times. And somebody who has made actually the business pages accessible to me, and a terrifically nice guy. And he's going to be in conversation with Joel Klein, someone who needs probably no introduction in this room. He's the Chancellor and CEO of the New York City Public Schools, the largest public school system in the country. Joel's had a distinguished career in private practice as a leader at the Justice Department and in the corporate world, and he has really been a leader in transforming the New York City public school system and a leader nationally in the education reform conversation. So we're delighted to have them both here this morning. And David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for such a great turnout this morning at an early hour, but not surprising for Joel. So we're just going to have a little bit of a conversation here, and then toward the end we're going to open it up, and there are going to be some mics scattered about, and I'm under strict orders to try to keep questions short because people assume we're going to have a whole bunch of them. So, Joel is a product of the school system that he now leads. I am a New Yorker as well. I'm very proud my children are 4th generation born New Yorkers. But we live just over the line. So my parents spent a few months trying to figure out whether we should cheat and get a New York address so I could apply to all of the magnet high schools, and ultimately decided that breaking the law was not the right thing to do. So I just went to the private school where my dad taught. But you went to which high school in New York?
I went to Bryan High School, but I'm glad to see your education didn't suffer, even though you didn't go to New York City Public Schools.
Thank you. So I guess I want to start by, we're going to get into some of the good details of what's going on today, but I want to start by looking at the big picture a little bit. 20 years is the number I have in my mind, but if you want to switch it to 10 or 25, that's your prerogative. I guess I'd ask you to look into the future a little bit and tell us what you see some of these big school systems looking like in 20 years. New York, Washington, Denver, Chicago. What strikes me is that in some of our biggest school systems, we've been engaged in incredibly bruising, difficult political fights over changing them. And in some ways, the progress we've made is remarkable. When you look at things like scores, which I know you put great faith in because you can't just make up whatever scores you want, right? They're real objective measurement. There's progress, but it's not stunning progress. And so I'd be interested both on the sort of overall of how good it is, but also some of the contours. What you imagine your school system and education generally looking like in the year 2030.
Sure. Well, you know, Yogi Berra always reminded us that predictions are a dangerous thing, especially when they're about the future. I in particular, have no great crystal ball. But let me at least say 2 things. One, I do think the system is moving now. I think there's an increasing coalescence around a few key ideas that are driving reform. I thought it was terrific this morning if you read New York Times editorial and then David Brooks both basically giving a shout out to President Obama, race to the top. A whole bunch of people in this room have been working on it. I've never felt more optimistic about where we're heading, but I don't think anyone should kid themselves. Today in America, about 1/3 to maybe 38% of our kids graduate from high school ready for college. So that gives you some indication of kind of where we are, even though overall we're seeing some rise in graduation rates, some higher scores, particularly on the national tests in math, less so in the upper grades in reading. We're obviously challenged globally where our position is declining vis-a-vis our competitors. If I were to think about a school system in the future, I think there are probably three big ideas and a lot of derivatives that will influence. First of all, we're so far behind in using technology and how we deliver instruction. You know, only in education, if you think about this, if you had fallen asleep literally 100 years ago and woke up, you could walk into the classroom, be one teacher, about 25, 28 kids, and not much would have changed. In virtually any other field, if you fell asleep 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you couldn't practice. You would have no clue what you're doing. So the use of technology, I think, is going to become a major, major factor. If you look at the Atlantic magazine that they put in the background materials for this conference, there's a story about the School of One. And I think we are going to see a big shift away from the classroom as the predominant locus of instruction to the individual as the recipient, and multiple modalities, whether it's online platforms, whether it's small group learning, and kids moving much, much more at their individual pace rather than what goes on now, which is really not very functional, which is one teacher in a classroom with 28 kids who have very different skills. And trying to teach and differentiate instruction, and there are others in this room who have done a lot in that field, but to try to do that across a classroom of 28 is really an enormous challenge, and there's no reason we should continue to focus that way. So I think it'll be very, very different, the development of platforms. I've told the textbook manufacturers that I think textbooks are a thing of the past in K-12 education, and you'll see much, much more differentiated content, platform delivery, differentiated modes. The notion of a 9 to 3 school day will change. There's no reason why kids can't be learning in different times, in different localities, and so forth. Second thing is something that Mark Tucker's here today. If you haven't read it, he came out with a commission study called Tough Choices or Tough Times, laid out a lot of big thinking about the way we transform the education system. A couple of key ideas in there worth thinking about. But one, in cities like New York and Denver and elsewhere, I think you're going to see much less the notion of a single monopoly school operator to much more of portfolio management, parent choice, public school choice, a lot of which we've done certainly at the high school level, some at the middle school level in New York. That's why we aggressively embraced charter schools. But I think what you're going to see school districts doing much more of, and the Obama people are driving this as well, is fundamentally looking for critical partnerships, bringing in people who can operate highly effective schools like the KIPS and the Uncommons and so forth. And they'll be public and charter and a mix and variety. And the more choice we give people, I think the better it'll drive the system and its reforms. I think the notion of how we use career and technical education will change. I think this has really been a place where the U.S. has been stalled for a long time. Other countries, Scandinavian countries, doing some good things in that field. Not everybody's going to go on for a 4-year liberal arts college education, and I think we ought to get ready for that. We have a school in New York where a kid ends up coming out as an apprentice in the union in the construction trades, makes over $50,000 a year in the school. Very, very successful. I think we'll see more of those things. And finally, probably in many ways a major difference, we'll see a very, very different teaching profession. Right now, the teaching profession is really locked into a trade union model, and I think as we move toward professionalizing teaching, rewarding success, increasing accountability, thinking about the use of technology to empower teachers, stop trying to micromanage what goes on in the classroom. I think those three core changes, in New York we call them talent management, portfolio management, and innovation/technology. They will be big drivers, and I don't think the school system will look in 20 or 30 years remotely like it looks today.
You mentioned the trade programs and liberal arts. Right now I don't know how New York differs from the country, but right now about 1/3 of young adults in this country end up getting 4-year college degrees, and some additional percentage get a 2-year degree. What's your sense for where that number should be in 20 or 30 years?
So again, I would think if we could take it to 50% on a 4-year degree, that would be good. And then I think this whole question of what's the value of a 2-year associate's degree and the success of community colleges is something we've got to look at. Matt Goldstein, who runs CUNY in New York, he and I have started something which I think you'll see a lot more of, 9 to 14 schools. And again, this is kind of an idea. It's a derivative of some of Mark Tucker's work in Tough Choices. but to start to think about doing really effective career technical training in a city like ours. You know, we got a lot of people who are looking for options in the healthcare industry, looking for options in the financial industry, and I think you'll see some kind of split like that. And I sure hope that the overall success rate is very different from what it is right now. I mean, as you know, in 1995, America, basically for the last half of the 20th century, we had, of all the OECD, the industrial countries, we had the highest college graduation rates. Right now, in 2005, we were 16th out of the 30 OECD countries and not moving in the right direction. Everybody else had moved up, and we were basically flat, and as a result, fell down significantly. And so I think those are real long-term competitive concerns for the country.
Have you thought at all about the breakdown of educational attainment by gender? Because one thing that really strikes me is that if the whole country were on the path that women have been on, to echo James Bennett's comments yesterday, we would really be in quite better shape than we are. Now, some of that over the last generation is women catching up with men, but it's not anymore. Women have well surpassed men in terms of four-year degrees. And so it seems to me in some ways a big part of the problem we have now is, can we make male teenage students and students in their young 20s more like women?
Right, no, it's obviously a big challenge, and those of us who are guys should be very sensitive about this because we're being left in the dust here. And it's an interesting corollary of something that I often comment about. People, when I went to Bryan High School in Astoria, Queens, this was really what I used to call a plain old neighborhood school. I mean, it wasn't established, there were no admissions criteria, pretty integrated, diverse school, phenomenal teachers. And probably one of the things that the women's movement did was really to open up opportunities for women who in the past would have gone into teaching, who were extraordinary. And as a result of that, it was probably the largest human capital subsidy that you could imagine for public education. That's, of course, changed. And indeed, America's teachers are now drawn from a very different level of the college graduates in the country, which creates its own challenge. But I do think part of what this School of One approach is doing is looking at different ways to engage men, boys in learning. And so, for example, we've got a program that works for some of our kids. It really is sort of putting them on one of these video games. But in order to become a master of the universe, you've got to be able to master increasingly hard mathematical equations. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of online learning that's taking place so will that work, and will we engage kids more effectively? It's hard to say, but it's a big issue. One of the things we've done in New York, which is starting to pay dividends, and it was very controversial when it did it, is go back to single-sex education. And some of our places like Eagle, which is an all-boys, predominantly African-American Latino school, getting good results. But I think we've got to look harder at the issue. The country's been so focused, and rightly so, on issues like the racial and ethnic achievement gaps that we're looking at, which if we could also close that, would have significant implications for where we stood overall. But the gender gap is a serious thing and worthy of more attention than it's getting.
We often hear stories about parents lining up to get into a charter school, right? Submitting applications for lotteries. And I think in a room like this, we take for granted the idea that education is incredibly beneficial economically, culturally, in terms of mental and physical health. I've actually been surprised, though, about how much skepticism there is in this country about that. You're frequently reading things in the media to be self-critical of my industry, questioning the value of an education, stories saying even in a recession, college graduates have lost their jobs. My reaction to that is, of course they have, right? We've had the worst recession in 30 years. But we just saw another one last week, saying that the unemployment rate for people with postgraduate degrees has risen from 3%, from 2-point-something% to 4%, right? Without making the comparison of what it is for everybody else. Right. How much skepticism do you find among both New York parents and New York students that even if they go through, even if they work hard, and get their degree, it's not going to be worth it because in the end their job's going to go to China or some larger force is going to prevent them from succeeding?
Very little on the ground. I mean, what you're talking about, what you see in New York is people literally lined up around the block trying to get lotteried into a great school, and deep belief that education matters. I think actually one of the myths that a lot of my friends have told me is that, until we fix poverty in America, we're not going to fix education. And I think we're proving the exact opposite is true. Until we fix education, we won't fix poverty. Deep belief in minority communities, if they get a shot, they're going to basically be able to play on the American dream. And the harder question is the kids. So we do surveys every year of our students, and I would say probably now is as high as we've gotten to, but only about 55 to 58% of our students say that they respect the kids in their schools who do well academically. So there's a deep skepticism about, and some of this goes to issues of race and other issues that we have to deal with. But boy, the parents that I see, and you know, we've got 40,000 people on waiting lists for charter schools. We get thousands of people on waiting lists for these new small high schools. A study done recently showed that they had cut a third of the achievement gap, 123 schools. So if there's the biggest takeaway, I'd like people in the room, I mean, many people taught me this, like Katie Haycock, who's here from Ed Trust, but the biggest takeaway is don't believe for a second we can't get entirely different outcomes in education. And that will have enormous long-term impact. When you say that, of course, in the largest recession we've seen in most of our lifetimes here, the fact that there's postgraduates who are losing jobs, but I mean, let's look at the kids who haven't graduated college or, you know, haven't graduated high school. I mean, in a city like New York, you know, children of color, enormous unemployment rates that we're dealing with, and rising much more rapidly than certainly well-educated kids. So I still think that the magic ingredient in America's sauce is that whoever you are, wherever you come from, and they still come. In my school system, every day I got kids coming from all over the world. They come here to get an education to improve the lives of their kids. And I think that myth, if we fight for it, will, I mean, or that reality will persist.
There have been a whole variety of studies looking at some of these reform efforts, and particularly looking at charter schools. And I would say, this is dangerous to summarize it so briefly, but I would say that in total, the research is disappointing to people who believe that choice in charter schools should make a difference. It doesn't say they can't make a difference, but the signs are mixed, and there's good and there's bad studies, and each side can pick their own studies to point to. What do you take away from that research? How do you grapple with it? Because I assume, like a lot of people, you wish it were a little more encouraging than it is.
So first of all, I do wish it were more encouraging, but I wish it were more encouraging across the board. I mean, this goes back to your opening question. So where are we? And we're still in the early innings of getting the kind of results that I think we need. But let me make a couple of points. I've never thought putting a label on a building is going to get better results. Calling a school a charter, letting it operate differently doesn't guarantee outcomes. And in a lot of states, they ramped up charters poorly, and as a result, you get a mix. But I think there are two things that are key points. One, those charters that are doing well, the KIPS, the Uncommons, Achievement First, and so forth, those that are starting to move to scale, put the lie to the notion that there's only so much we can do for kids who come from very troubled backgrounds, very challenged environments, put the lie to the notion that poverty is destiny in education. And that's an important lie to expose, even if you don't get it at every school. I mean, some of your colleagues used to say, well, that's because they get all these teachers who work really hard, etc. But I don't want to know why it happens. I want to know that it happens. Then we can figure out how it happens and drive it, because as long as people believe poverty is destiny and dysfunctional family means you're not going to be well educated, then we're going to be stuck in the excuse game, and as long as we're in the excuse game, we'll fail at this. Second of all, there's no dispute, no doubt that New York City charters, which we did very differently, we did not, most school districts play oppositional to charters. From day one, the mayor and I said we wanted to make New York City the Silicon Valley for charters, and we attracted the great charter operators. And we've now got, when we started, we had about 16. Next year, when I open school in September, I'll have 127 charters. And every study, whether Carolyn Hoxby or Mackie Raymond, who did the large study that showed nationally, she used the same, showed nationally it was a wash. She used the same methodology in New York and showed we're getting big results, and so did Hoxby. So of our current operating 100 charters, I would say 3/4 of them are really outperforming comparable schools. So if you do this right, if you give them space like we do, I mean, I take the view that charters, the space belongs to the kids, and that those kids who want to go to charter schools, they should have room in our schools. Those kids who want to go to traditional public schools should have room. But the space doesn't belong to some sort of amorphous group out there. It follows the child, just like the resources. And the results are powerful. And make no mistake about it, there are 40,000 people on wait lists for these schools because they're getting dramatically different results. If you haven't seen the lottery about one of our charters up in Harlem called Harlem Success, which is getting outside results. It's outperforming lots and lots of middle-class schools with an entire population of reasonably high poverty and African-American Latino kids. So these are big, big differences. And the way I want to frame the concept, because look, choice in and of itself isn't going to solve the problem. Parents can choose bad schools. There are probably people in this room who have chosen bad schools for their kids. But there's something very wrong about the following sort of scene, which you'll see in every large city. Take Central Park in New York. It's got 4 borders, north, east, south, and west, right? And if you live on the east side of Central Park, the south side of Central Park, or the west side of Central Park, you insist on choice for your children. There's nobody who lives in those communities that would let me simply assign their kid to any school and they would say, okay, that's the school. Why should people who live on the north side of the park not have choices for their kids? And if you give them choices, it will bring an accountability to the system that will change the system. So our high schools now, by and large, is a complete choice system. And I have kids not just going to Stuyvesant, but who are willing to travel 40 minutes on a subway or an hour to go to a new small school that focuses on the arts or on music or focuses on science and technology. And these kids, we do like a medical match. You know, my old college roommate is here. I remember when he went through this medical match for his residency and so forth. Well, we do that for our high schools, and more than half the kids get their first choice. And so as a result of that, more and more kids, and it goes back to your question about how you engage kids, they're going where they want to go, and that has real power. So choice in and of itself isn't going to solve the problem, but it's a little hard to say to people that when you're affluent or even middle class, you have choices in education. When you're poor, you get whatever the school system serves up, and if you don't like that, tough. And one of the things that this whole charter thing has done in our new small high schools, which are all public high schools, has really empowered communities that weren't traditionally empowered to think about education as the way out and to reinforce the notion that you can get a great education, come from nowhere. You know, a kid like me grew up in public housing, who, if it weren't for education, trust me, I wouldn't be here on this stage today. A kid like that, that dream is so essential to who we are. And when you see it happening in communities in a city like ours, it's very, very powerful. And it's got to be part of a much larger set of reforms, but certainly a part.
I want to talk for a second about evaluation. I spent a lot of last year writing about healthcare, and I spent some time sort of inside the workings of a hospital out here in Utah. And I sat in on a committee for labor and delivery, and they were reviewing the case of a doctor who was off the charts in terms of much longer deliveries, many more C-sections, and they'd written this doctor a letter and they'd informed him what the data shows. And the doctor had written back, and the head of this committee, who was also a doctor, said to the room full of other doctors and nurses, "What do you think this outlier doctor's response was?" And 3 people shouted, "The data's wrong." And the head of the table said, "Exactly. That's what everyone always says." And when we're confronted with data that makes us look not so great, our first reaction is the data is wrong. Right. And I know you've encountered that. And so I don't want to give this notion that there's no such thing as a good way to evaluate people too much credence. But having said that, there obviously are flaws in any metric system, as you well know. And so I'd love you to talk about how you try to deal with some of those flaws. I mean, to me, some of the best critiques of some of these metrics are that they can be variable year to year. Howard Gardner, who's here in the room, and Dick Murnane, an economist who's looked at education, say some of these teacher ratings, they move more year to year than you would like if you thought they were really capturing the underlying quality of the teacher. What's the right mix of objective and subjective, and how do we make sure that we're essentially not giving teachers credit or blame for the kids they're assigned on August 30th?
So this is the $64 question.
Yes.
Right? But let's take a step back, because, you know, when I started this job, one of the big things that struck me is in K-12 education, there's zero accountability. I mean, everybody explains why the system, we get the wrong kids or this or that, the test is no good, the data are poor, et cetera, et cetera. And it struck me that there are 2 fundamental truths that we have to drive the system. One of which I quote from Al Shanker, but you can't find this quote anywhere on the internet anymore. I probably have the last copy of his paper, which is, if it's not about students and student outcomes and the teacher's impact on those, then it's about power. And it's about adults. And that seems to me to characterize the system. So you've got to transform it to a system that's built on accountability. Now, let me say, what David says is absolutely right. You know, I'm a big believer in accountability, but trust me, when something goes amok and the mayor calls me for what he calls an accountability discussion, my view of accountability is like everybody else. He must have had the wrong data or something like that, because I'm not so interested in that discussion.
Bob's going to fix that.
Yeah, no, but you know, Bob's going to fix that. Wait until he calls Bob for an accountability phone call. Say, how the hell did that happen on the east side? So that's a, and the second piece I always rely on is Jim Collins' piece in Good to Great for Social Institutions. You know, this is true of philanthropic organizations, it's true of community organizations and so forth, which is there's no perfect accountability metrics. I mean, what Collins says has got to be right. You know, so mammograms are not perfect. He says test scores are not perfect. And you can go on and on. But what you try to find is reasonable metrics that you improve over time as you learn. But that gives you a way to see if your system is moving forward. So for me in New York, high school graduation, is this a perfect metric? Of course not. But is it a pretty good metric? Sure it is. And would I much rather graduate 75% of my kids than 50% of my kids? You're damn right I would. And so there's a metric I look at. Now the test scores. You know, would I rather, these test scores, the tests are not nearly robust enough, they're not challenging enough. But I'm awfully proud of the fact that in 3 of the 4 national tests, New York City has outperformed both the rest of the nation and massively outperformed the rest of my state, which is subject to similar academic standards, same academic standards. So those things matter to me. And on our state tests, we all admit have to be harder. But our city has dramatically outperformed the rest of our state and other big cities like Buffalo and Rochester and Albany and so forth in our state. So those things really matter. They matter to my teachers, they matter to my kids. You do better on the test, your likelihood of graduation, I've correlated this time and again, increases. Now, to answer the question, 2 questions that are sort of inherent in this. Number 1, is that simply about the kids? It is, if you do what we did in No Child Left Behind and say proficiency is what matters. Early on, we changed that in New York. We created our own accountability system, and we look at progress, because I think it matters. If you have a whole bunch of challenged kids who come with special needs, kids who are English language learners, and you compare that to a school that's gifted and talented, well, of course, you're going to get very different outcomes. By definition, we screened for kids who do well on tests for our gifted and talented programs. So I measure progress. Even in gifted and talented programs, you'll see different progress, but I try to compare apples to apples. And what you'll see then, and Howard's research is an important cautionary note on it, but I don't think it in and of itself is dispositive of the following. I'll look at teachers over 2-3 years, and I'll see some of them, let's just say on a 4.5 scale, which we have in New York, move their kids from a 2.8 to a 3.2. And so one year they may not have gotten a 0.4 jump, one year they got a 0.2, one year they got a 0.3, etc. But if you start to look at those patterns, you'll see big differences. And some of my teachers are moving their kids year after year from a 2.8 to a 2.5. And so would I rather have a teacher in my classroom teaching my kid who's at a 2.8, moving them to a 2.5 versus one moving them to a 3.2? I think that's a pretty easy case. Now, if it's a 2.9 versus a 2.88 gain and stuff like that, I think you put far too much weight on small differences. But I see big differences when I look at the numbers. And so in our tenure work and so forth, when we deny tenure, we're looking at 3 years worth of data. And again, am I going to have some false negatives when I do this kind of analysis? Always in life. But if the alternative is to let everyone have tenure in my school system and then have no way to rid the school system of it, I'd much prefer a system that has a few false negatives in it. And then the final thing is, how much should be objective student growth data and so forth? You can argue about this all around. So in my state now, they say about 40%. Michelle Rhee, who many of you heard the other night, got a contract in DC. They do about 50%. I'd say 40 to 50% is reasonable. I could live with a third. I could live with 50%. The other 2 components, it seems to me, ought to be peer evaluation, which works quite well. Really have superior master teachers who are analyzing other teachers and looking at the way they perform, as well as supervisory principals, assistant principals in the right circumstance. And what you'll develop is exactly what the Obama administration is developing. We'll develop a 4-tier evaluation system, and our highest tiers, our highly effective teachers, will be very different from our ineffective teachers. And I would submit to you that most people, if you walk into those classrooms, and I do it now, and I look at the difference where teachers have significant what we call value add or growth numbers, and I compare it to teachers who have poor value add or growth numbers, and I watch them teach the class unbeknownst to them that I'm correlating their data, there are big differences, and you see it in the classrooms. And I'll tell you, it's not that hard to spot ineffective teaching in a school system. And we're not talking about, you know, a third or 50%, but we are talking about 5 or 7 or 8% that we ought to be focused on over time and move the system forward, because that impacts us.
What about parents and kids? Should they play any role in the evaluation?
I've thought about it. I use parents and kids to in surveys and how we grade our schools and count that. I'm a little concerned about the popularity problem of evals. It's virtually no one right now in terms of teacher evaluation is using parent and kid surveys. In school evaluation, we are using them for basically 10% of a school's overall grade.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to questions if we want to get the microphones out. Let's have an accountability moment for the Obama administration. Give us your thoughts about how they're doing and also some of the things that I think we're about to see, right? So there's this whole debate over whether Race for the Top is going to lose some money. There's also the question whether, as Steve Brill wrote about recently, whether the second round winners of Race for the Top are going to be a lot weaker and whether it's going to be more of a political popularity contest.
So I give the Obama administration enormous credit for what they did in not just Race to the Top, but their school improvement grants, closing down failing schools. I mean, they're basically doing something you don't see much of in the federal government. So in the federal government, the way they give out money, and have always given out money in education, is kind of equal dollars based, for example, on number of high poverty kids, with zero accountability built into it. So what the Obama administration did was to take almost $10 billion all in from a variety of programs to try to drive reform. And lo and behold, they got a lot of reform. I mean, we lifted a charter cap in New York, which I don't believe we would have lifted if it weren't for Race to the Top. These evaluation systems, the legislation in Colorado we recently saw, which goes to a pretty sophisticated evaluation system that's going to help move the discussion we were just having forward. So you don't see that in government, where the government, instead of just funding everybody on an equal basis, is fundamentally trying to drive reform, and somewhere around $10 billion, particularly in a tight economy, has a big impact. So I think what they're doing is well. I think it was a mistake for Obie and the House to eliminate $800 million out of this pot. I'm glad to see that immediately 12 Democrat senators immediately signed on to oppose that, and the New York Times today came out with. But think about this. Two things that really strike me right now is enormous sort of bipartisan approval when people like Jeb Bush, who did really strong work in Florida on education reform, he's out there saying, criticizing the president on a lot of things, but saying on education, he's right. You read the New York Times, you got their editorial page, you got David Brooks, you got Nick Kristof, you got recently Bob Herbert talking about charter. It's a wide array of people from very different ideological and philosophical points of view. So it seems to me that the administration deserves great credit. You know, Steve and others have done a lot of work pointing out that Race to the Top will have a political dimension to it, and the proof will ultimately be in the pudding whether those states that get the awards make the reforms and get different results. Will this be a panacea? No, it won't be, but it'll change the way we think about the relationship between the federal government and real accountability in education reform. As long as we keep giving more money to those schools that do worse, I mean, that was for the longest time. If your school did poorly, they gave you more money. Then if you turned around and got off the bad guy list, they took the money away. So you had no incentive to get off the bad guy list. So now what they're doing is shutting down schools, and that's a very hard play. In New York, I've closed down 90 schools, and I always like to say, and every one of them felt worse than a root canal, because people don't like you to close down schools. The adults in the schools are affected by it. As you phase them down, they have political consequences and so forth. But the administration is way out there and is driving, and for the first time I see a lot of my colleagues, for example, saying, we're going to shut down 7 this year or 5 this year, and really tried to replace them with much higher functioning schools. That's what we did in New York, and I'd like to kind of end on a cheerful story, because I shut down Bushwick High School in my 2nd year on the job. I spent a lot of time in Bushwick with the community. School had a 28% graduation rate. It's breathtaking in New York to have a 28% graduation rate. Enormous opposition to it. 4 years later, we had the first graduating class of the new schools we had put in the building where we had eliminated Bushwick High School. And these were like 4 or 5 small, theme-based, partnership-based schools of choice. And the graduation rate for that community went up almost to 70%. And they had a march. So there was so much pride that they were looking at numbers that were entirely different from the numbers they had looked at before. So I think the Obama administration gets great credit on it. I hope they stick to it. And I think it's gutsy, right? When Obie, on a bill they want $10 billion. And what's the first thing they do is, when he tried to cut their programs, was to issue a veto threat. And not surprisingly, you got the ire and the dander of the unions up, and you saw the New York Times yesterday had a big story that the unions always hold, the 2 national unions hold their conferences this time of the year, NEA and AFT. And you saw they didn't invite the Obama people, so they're trying to send a message that they're going to push back. But I think, I've worked closely with Arnie Duncan when he was in Chicago and as secretary, and I think they're onto something big, and I think it's good federal policy, and they'll stick with it.
In the back. Do we have microphones? There you go. And then maybe we can bring one right over here for next.
Can you talk a little bit about the Harlem Children's Zone and the holistic approach of working in impoverished communities to elevate not just the education system, but parenting skills and a lot of other aspects to look for good outcomes?
It's a great model, and it's another one of these models that and I'll explain to people what it is in a second. It's another one of the models that the Obama administration put some serious federal dollars against to try to see if it can be replicated. So if you haven't seen Waiting for Superman, you should see it. I think it's going to be featured here this week. Waiting for Superman was titled by Jeff Canada, an African-American who grew up in New York, and said to his mother he can't understand why African-Americans do so poorly in education, and he finally came to the conclusion it would never be fixed unless Superman got involved, and so that's what the title of the movie is all about. But Jeff is a Superman and a super person, and early on what he decided to create was really to look at a number of blocks in Harlem, like 8 blocks by 8 blocks, 64 square blocks that he then increased. And he started with a thing called Baby College, and he ran Baby College through the Harlem Gems, and he really got kids from 0 to 5 in a truly holistic approach, teaching parents parenting skills, getting high expectations for kids, creating the options and opportunities. But it's very interesting. When I took this job, he came to me and he said he was finding that even though the kids came to school prepared, as they went through the schools, they weren't succeeding. And that led him, along with a whole bunch of other people, to open up Promise Academy and several other charter schools in Harlem. So now he has a complete 0 to 18 fully developed system, which I predict will get some very interesting results. Roland Frye did some research for him, which again, David Brooks reported in the Times not long ago. Other communities are now going to try to replicate it. The questions are 2, whether, how much you're going to get the kind of leadership and vision that Jeff had to be able to drive that. And then the second is what the economic viability. There are other models like that, community in schools that Bill Milken developed, that's also getting good results. But the replication, and this goes to a question David asked me before, the replication of successful models presents its own challenge, and it's making sure we get those things right. But incentivizing like the federal government is doing, I think makes great sense. And I think if we could create more of these children's zones throughout the country, then people will get more confidence in them.
Let's go here first and then back there.
Good morning.
morning.
Marge Minicozy. I've been an educator most of my life, and most of it in New York. And I wonder what your thoughts are about maintaining the tenure system and why.
So tenure is a loaded word, and I guess it depends what one means by tenure. The current tenure system we have, which means after 3 years, virtually everyone gets tenure, and then it's impossible in the absence of some significant malfeasance, sexual abuse, real physical abuse, to get rid of people. I think that doesn't work. I mean, I think Steve Brill's piece on the rubber room exposed what was going on in terms of a tenure system that protected virtually everything except the most egregious behavior, and even there took years to get rid of people. So I think you need an evaluation system that has reasonable due process, but that people can move through so that a revoking tenure is not like a capital case in America. And I think if you had good metrics, it goes back to the discussion David was asking me about, if you had a reasonable evaluation system so that people who were effectively evaluated, including meaningful peer review, and if they were ineffective for a year or 2 years, they could be removed. That's what Michelle Rhee negotiated with Randy Weingarten, and I think is a model for the nation. I think that system would work, but current tenure law is not working. When I took the job, I made a speech. It was early on a most controversial speech. I always like to say, when the mayor introduced me, he said I would make the tough and sometimes controversial decisions necessary to change education. And he recently called me and he said, you know, when I said tough and sometimes controversial, I didn't mean always controversial. But I said that education was built on the 3 pillars of mediocrity: lockstep pay, lifetime tenure, and seniority. And I think the transformation that I see in the teaching profession, which we're in the middle of now, it'll be a very, very different teaching profession. And quite frankly, I think the professionalization of teaching is long overdue in America. And the trade union model of teachers who get paid more simply for showing up another year is a totally broken model.
My name is Don Spiro. You mentioned a number of times small schools when you were rattling off characteristics, the implication being small is better. And I wonder if you could expand on that. There are some very fine large public high schools, of course, that we're all aware of.
Good point to make. And if I gave the impression that small is always better, that would be an erroneous impression. Obviously, we have some enormously large high schools in New York City and throughout the country: Townsend Harris, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, Madison High School in New York, so forth and so on. Where small schools, I thought, became essential to our strategy, and the Gates Foundation was so supportive of the work we did here, was in communities that had large numbers of kids coming into high school who were years behind. And that's a very different challenge. So if you take 3,000 kids who by and large on average are a year, 18 months, 2 years behind when they get to high school, and try to basically do a school of 3,000, it's not going to work. The anomie of the school, the chaos of the school doesn't work. So if, on the other hand, if you take 3,000 kids who are ready for high school, or in some of my schools, way past ready for high school, that's going to work. What we did is to take those schools that had 30 or 35 or even 40% graduation rates year in and year out, broke those schools up by phasing out the large school, replacing it 3 or 4. So the personalization, the bringing in community, when I got there, the thing was so hermetically sealed. So I don't understand. Gaston Caperton, the College Board, is here. He runs, I don't know, 8, 9 of my schools now. He's an enormously talented guy. He's got lots of great people on his staff. They want to come help in K-12 so that more people are ready for college, do better in college. Why shouldn't I enlist him? Outward Bound, they partner with us. They've opened up a handful of schools, the Asia Society, and these new small schools are driving reform. When you get the kind of results that MDRC did a study where we literally had a control group of kids who applied to the same schools and then didn't get in because they were oversubscribed, they lotteried out, and the demographics were identical in the control group as in the admitted group, and you see a 7-point difference in graduation rate. That's a third of the achievement gap in my city. Those are big results, uncharacteristic in education. So I think that model works, but I'd be the first to say, large high schools that are succeeding, we should keep growing those where possible.
We have a question right up here. I was supposed to ask everyone to introduce themselves, which you all are doing very well anyway, but now I will ask you to.
Good morning. My name's Peter Brodsky. I'm on the board of the first KIPP school in Dallas, and it seems to me, based on my experience, there's two key success factors. One is more time, and the other is more autonomy for the school leader to operate the school in an entrepreneurial way. And what I don't understand is those would be fairly easy to roll out across regular public schools, just increase the length of the day so kids have more time in school and less time that's unstructured. Why is that so difficult to do?
I think it's just a cost factor. I think it also raises some questions. Not a lot of teachers don't want to work additionally. There's nothing wrong with it. They just choose the profession because for a lot of them, they can end up going home, be with their kids when they get home and so forth. So there's big personal choice issues here. But you're absolutely right. You know, Cory Booker says it all the time, is what we do is we hold time constant and outcomes variable. Why don't we hold outcomes constant and time variable? I mean, how long are we going to be at this 9 to 3 thing when we know it's not working? The other thing that KIPP and other places do is, though, they have so much more flexibility. It's not just innovation, but they have more flexibility. KIPP, going back to this woman's question about tenure, there's no tenure at a place like KIPP. KIPP, I spent a lot of time with people from KIPP, David and others. You know, the way you recruit school leaders is an art form. I mean, and critical. And then the way school leaders recruit teachers and so forth. And as you scale, those challenges will get greater. But I do think being able to work in an environment where you get big outcomes and a sense of success is enormously positive incentive for lots of great people to want to come to work. So I think your scaling will work. But there's no question that it's a replicable model. And last week, the Mathematica study on KIPP showed big results there as well.
Could that ever be done in the public school?
Yeah, well, see, that's what Mark Tucker and tough choices or tough times. Why don't we move the public school system to a much more, in effect, charterized model? Hold the schools rigorously accountable. Let the partners work with us, whether it's KIPP or whether it's Urban Assembly in New York that's working with us, or the College Board or whatever. And as long as they're getting great results, then let's double down on them. And if they're not, let's take them out of the game, just like we should do at KIPP. You know, I sit down with KIPP and I tell them, you know, you've got 8 or 9 schools here in my city. Some of them are really outstanding. Others, quite frankly, you could do a better job with. And I think you can create that environment. But if you start with a very top-down, every school is the same, somebody in Central is going to figure out how to fix it. I mean, the KIPP schools, the people at Central don't figure out how to fix those schools. Schools are an indigenous culture that fundamentally the people inside have got to figure out what the solutions are.
Hi, Charlotte Steele. I'm a teacher in New York City. Chancellor Klein, my question has to do with the rigor of requirements for 8th grade graduation and 12th grade graduation. When you think about, not just in New York City, but other cities, high schoolers only need 1 math regents to graduate. And you think about if 8th graders are ready for high school when they graduate and 12th graders are ready for college. Sorry, I had too much coffee. You know, can you talk about the challenge of balancing keeping those graduation rates improving, but also working on the rigor of our standards? Because you look at the content of an 8th grade exam in math versus other countries, and I've heard you say that an 8th grader that graduates proficient in math only has a 50% chance of graduating high school, versus one that's above grade level in math in 8th grade has a 90% chance of graduating.
So first of all, thank you for teaching my children. I really am. My heroes in life are the people who teach our kids, so I want to thank you for that. Second of all, and she teaches in a very challenging school and is a very talented math teacher. But let me just say, this issue of standards is critical, and it's another area where the Obama administration got really big results quite quickly by creating interesting incentives and working with the Governors Association. There's no purpose to graduate half the kids who graduate high school who are unprepared for college. and therefore they got a high school diploma, but they're going nowhere. So we're going to have to raise our standards significantly. And doing that, we're going to take a hit across the country to our graduation rates. But what's going on now is these core common standards, which will really raise the bar significantly, so that what the administration now calls college or job ready will become the future. And everybody, including myself, realizes that right now there are kids who graduate from high school in New York who are not college ready. That's not unique to New York. Throughout the country, lots of kids who are in community colleges are being remediated. They shouldn't be remediated. They should be prepared. So over the next several years, what we'll see is new standards will drive much greater demands on the school system, will mean everybody's graduation rates will be affected by this. But if we don't set the right bar, then we're kidding ourselves, and what Arnie Duncan says is, and lying to children. And I think it's past time for us to lie to children. If America wants to compete globally, we damn well better have real standards. For the longest time, I've been advocating national standards, because kids in Ohio don't compete with kids in New York City. They compete with kids in China and India, Singapore, and so forth. And if we don't get our standards right, then our performance is going to pay a big price for it. But if we only get our standards right and don't do the other reforms, then our kids are going to pay the price. Because the easiest thing is to raise the bar without ensuring the kids get the education to meet that heightened bar.
Let's go back here.
Hi, I'm Julie Dorschlag. I live in DC. I have a question. What happens to the kids who can't stay in the well-performing, high-performing charter schools when they do drop out? Or some of the dissenters say the charter schools kick them out. What has New York done with those children? What has happened
so
to them?
we agreed to legislation to address those issues. I don't think that kids should be kicked out. Some kids in any school system, I have kids in some of my schools who have needs that clearly can't be met, and you need highly specialized programs. That should be true of charters. It should be true of kids in the public schools. We should have a real accountability for all the kids in the system. But in the end, there's always going to be some portion of kids who come to school with highly specialized needs that we need to meet, and the rest of the kids, whether it's traditional public or charters system, should be accountable. But that's no excuse, and this bothers me about the debate. When I see kids who, in the same exact kids, some of them lotteried in, some lotteried out, so we know that they both tried to get in, so it wasn't about parental motivation or so forth. And then you see entirely different results in those schools. That's a big deal to me. And so even though some people say, well, a few special ed kids, they were told not to stay at this school, I mean, we should monitor that and fix that. But this is not one where we should throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Way in the back.
My name's Megan Hartman, and I'm actually a math teacher at Glenwood Springs High School. My question for you, and I completely agree that there needs to be more accountability in education, and that the current tenure system doesn't work. But how do you, in using test scores and other measures to, I guess, in some ways, keep your job, how do you still make sure that teachers are innovative and doing, making sure that they're really trying to engage the students? I have the fortune of having a principal who really, really pushes making sure that we use classroom instruction that works and that we're just doing our best to teach our kids the best way possible. But if test scores become a part of keeping my job, how do you make sure that the amount of work that gets put into new innovative teaching doesn't start going down?
So in the end, it depends on a couple of things. One, what we test, and I think we need to do a much better job. There's, again, a lot of federal money out there to develop new, more robust assessments. In the end, at some point, we need to know if our students have mastered knowledge, which is critical to their education, skills, which are critical to their education, and there's a way to assess that. No assessment is perfect, but we need to do a better job. If you tie that to a progress metric, then I think you can fairly, not perfectly, but fairly evaluate people. And if you look at multiple years, you can see outcomes. I don't think innovation is incompatible with success. I think innovation is more compatible with success. My School of One, in terms of growth in test scores, is showing very different results from comparable schools or different schools in the city. So I think innovation, and we've got a couple of innovative models in New York now that are getting good results, different results. So I think innovation is consistent with it. Second of all, if you have peer review and supervisory review, you can start to measure whether there's correlation in the overall view. If a teacher's getting very high peer review scores and supervisory scores and not getting equally good scores on the metrics, that's at least a place where one would want to inquire. But in the end, when you start to look at, for example, if you move kids from 3.0 to 3.5 in 8th grade math and 8th grade English in New York, if you take them that level, our high school graduation rate would go up from 54% to almost 80%. That's a lot of kids. Even though we need to raise the bar on high school, there's a lot of kids affected. That can only happen if teachers are moving them forward, engaging them, and success in school, whether it's against tests or portfolios or whatever metric you're trying to use, success in school won't come if teachers don't effectively engage students. I mean, that's the essential ingredient. So I think this is doable. I think it's easy to say, you know, some of the tests can be gamed. It's easy to say what David legitimately says, not every metric is perfect. But we've got to find metrics that work and continue to perfect them, not simply say because every metric is imperfect, we're going to give up the game and go back to the old system where everybody did fine except for the kids.
Is it fair to say that public education simultaneously suffers from too much mechanical testing and not enough accountability?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, right down here. Go ahead, I can repeat it. No. Go ahead, I'll repeat it.
Now it's actually
Now it's
on.
on.
Now it's on? Okay. So I've been a longtime supporter of Teach for America. Every time I meet with these young men and women, they're really inspiring. But my question is there, I know there's such a thing as burnout. Maybe teaching isn't made for a 30, 40-year career simply because, boy, that's hard work. And you got to wonder how people can sustain that enthusiasm over a period of time. I'd be interested in your comments.
I think it's a legitimate question, and I think, put it this way, if you can get more and more people who are teaching effectively or engaged for 8 or 10 years, that could have a huge impact. One of the things that I've tried to do with Teach for America is to figure out ways to extend career ladders for those people, to keep them in the system more than 2 years, which I don't think is a good number. But I'm working with them in New York. I'll probably in 2011, 2012, I'll have 100 Teach for America principals in New York City public and charter schools, so creating those kind of opportunities. But look, in the end, some people will teach and stay engaged in teaching for a career. You know, I stayed in the law for 25 years and then decided I just wanted to move in a different direction. A lot of my friends stayed in the law for their entire lifetime. Some of them were as enthusiastic in their 30th year as they were in their first, and some of them were unenthusiastic in their first year. I mean, it's just highly variable outcomes in this situation. But I don't think we need a model that says you either teach, and a lot of this is driven by the pension system, which we were going to touch on. Whereas, you know, if you get a defined benefit pension, then once you're in the system 10 or 12 or 15 years, you want to stay on the track to get your pension, because that's going to be a very, very significant economic incentive. There's a kid today in the Daily News wrote an article who teaches at charter school in New York, who talked about how he wants to teach for 10 years, loves the fact that he has a defined contribution benefit plan, and that he can then take that with him after 10 years. He doesn't feel like he's stuck in a system. That's a reform we're going to see, I think, throughout the country. Pension reform. It didn't work in the auto industry. It's not going to work in the school industry.
Great. We are out of town, unfortunately. I see lots of good hands, but I want to let people get to the next events. Thank you so much, Joel.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thanks a lot.